Hello, and welcome to our webinar, How AI Demands Organizational Change, New Approaches to Collaboration, Technology, and Trust. I'm Ann Stewart, Senior Editor for Custom Content at MIT SMR Connections. On today's webinar, our panelists will discuss new research that we conducted with SAS. We found that organizations that are implementing AI widely have recognized the need to make significant changes in order to enable cross-functional collaboration, provide a more robust and up-to-date IT infrastructure, and manage new risks that can jeopardize trust in AI. Leading the discussion today is SAS Strategic Advisor Kimberly Nevela. She's joined by Peter Guerra, Chief Data Scientist for Accenture North America, Rob Stillwell, Senior Vice President and Business Analytics Officer for Seacoast Bank, and Captain Michael Kanan, who recently became Director of Operations for the U.S. Air Force MIT Artificial Intelligence Accelerator. Previously, he was the Air Force's co-chair for AI, and he's also the author of the forthcoming book, T-AI, Humanity's Countdown to Artificial Intelligence and New Pursuit of Global Power. Kimberly, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome to everyone joining us today. We know that you and your organizations are being challenged to innovate and to adapt to new ways of working under what is currently unprecedented pressure. And in this environment, the focus on artificial intelligence, or AI, which is already pretty well publicized, is even more amplified. But the reality here is that most companies are still in the very early stages of AI adoption. In fact, under a quarter of organizations have reported they've gone past pilots or even initial planning. And of those, only 5% have adopted AI at scale across their organization, while 19 or 18% have implemented in a single business unit or a few processes. But while this segment is small, it is mighty, and it provides some valuable lessons we can all learn from. So today we're going to share this research and our real-life AI experiences. Now, when it comes to AI, very often the opportunities seem almost limitless. We can see this today relative to the pandemic, where AI is being proposed to address everything from digital health to contact tracing, supply chain optimization, and drug discovery. But I think that sometimes this wealth of opportunity can actually be paralyzing. So Peter, you've sagely noted that you don't focus on, I'm going to do AI, but you focus on, for instance, supply chain and how to leverage AI to do that. So what does that mean? And can you tell us how companies are moving from aspiration to action?
Absolutely, thank you. And thanks for having me. This is the #1 question that I get from all of our clients across North America and worldwide. And the idea that companies and the people who are running them are looking at the ways that they can shift from the POCs or POVs into more of an enterprise adoption for AI. This quote really is all about companies that I see that take that step to go from that aspiration to wanting to more enterprise are thinking about how they can use the technology of the AI, really not looking at what is the value drivers and the ROI that they're after first, and then how AI can help them. So I think from a first step perspective, what we typically recommend and work with our clients around is understanding all of the different business dynamics, the different value drivers, the amount of ROI, either from a cost savings and efficiencies perspective or from a new products or services perspective. Where are those opportunities? And then you apply the lens of then how do you adopt and use AI in order to help support that for either insights or to drive decisions or things like that. That's really the first step that we work with our clients on. The second is then looking at kind of what your assets are, what do you have that can help enable that? And that's both from a technical perspective, but also from an organizational perspective. So talent, how the company incentivizes kind of agile innovation and things like that. And then third is all around, what do you have from a data perspective? So companies that want to move from that aspiration to the enterprise, typically the ones that we see that are the most successful really do focus on that upfront strategy and value driver exercise. And then everything flows from that and how they can use AI to help with that.
Yeah, that's great. So Rob, as a small to medium-sized business, how do you approach AI strategy? And is your experience different from what Peter has shared?
I really think that's a great quote and completely agree with Peter. To elaborate on our perspective, the industry that we're in, banking, is hundreds of years old and exists today for the exact same reasons as always. For example, people want to keep their money safe. They want to invest. They want to finance things. They want to be able to pay for things and so forth. So really our strategies are focused on the same topics as before AI and ML ever existed. And really it's about unleashing the power of AI to achieve those goals.
That's great. And so for both of you and Mike as well, is this a top-down or a bottom-up exercise or a combination of the two?
Yes, when I first started at Seacoast, I remember about a month or so in, the company, they had a conference where we all watched the movie Moneyball, if you remember that movie by, had Brad Pitt in it, and it had the, the use of AI to revolutionize the baseball industry. So when I started, it really did feel top down in that sense. However, as I started, I also learned there was sort of a homegrown database that was stood up in our credit risk department where they began collecting data from our core provider. So there really was this kind of grassroots foundation as well. And I really think it was because of both those forces that we were able to be successful.
Yeah, that's great. Now, one of the other things that we hear a lot about, and we certainly hear about this in the context of digital transformation, which is the need to break down functional silos. And the research that we did really does show that a significant majority believe that artificial intelligence requires more cross-functional organizations, more collaboration, and support then by training, including across disciplines. But this is, I think, often easier said than done. It's easier to say to collaborate than to get people to do that. Now, Mike, the U.S. Air Force is a complicated organism by pretty much any definition. So how do you go about enabling broad engagement with AI within this complex ecosystem?
Thanks, Ann and Kimberly, and thanks to the panelists and everyone dialed in on the line now. I think I want to start with a quote. And Einstein is often attributed with saying, you don't really understand something unless you can explain it to your grandmother. And I think that's true. But had Einstein known my own grandmother, he probably would have altered his words a little slightly. A more precise adage would be, your grandmother is likely the smartest person you'll ever encounter. So if she doesn't understand your explanation, it's sure no one else will either. So with that in mind, that's our backdrop for thinking about an enterprise scale. In our case, 650,000 strong if you include the total force, civilians and contractors, performing jobs across all the fields you see here. But people often forget we are more alike than we are different. If you can name a job in the private sector, it's likely we have that same job in the Air Force. So over the past half decade in this field, I've learned a lot about the common misperceptions and misgivings people have when trying to understand AI. Most conversations on the topic, whether it's in an auditorium, our offices, or coffee shops, either begin or end with one or more of the following questions. 1, what is AI? 2, what aspects of our lives will be changed by it? 3, which of those will be beneficial and which harmful? 4, where do nations of the world stand in relation to one another, in my case, especially Russia and China, which more broadly we are concerned with? And the most important question is, what can we do to ensure that AI is only used in legal, moral, and ethical ways? And all those answers to those questions merit long discussions, and they're open to totally differing opinions, but they should be manageable as enterprises and factually accurate. The topic shouldn't be tough to discuss or debate. But the conversational disconnect that usually occurs isn't because of some complex technical detail or a computer issue. It's simply and usually because of the same old obstacles that too often stand in the way of many conversations. Regardless of the topic, we too frequently speak below, above, around, or past one another, especially when we don't have an equal amount of information or a shared base of knowledge or a common set of experiences. So how do we get past that is the question. And here's the analogy I like to use and what we're working with our large organization with. I'm quite certain that nobody on the line knows how to build an entire car. And I mean the whole car, the electronics, the navigation system, the engine, change a tire, which by the way is a great life skill I hope many of us do have. But each of us don't know how to build a car, don't fully understand it works. So the question we should ask ourselves related to AI is, why do we trust cars? And the answer is because we use them. We know when something is wrong. We have established lanes in the road, pun intended. We know how they can be used for bad. We know how they're used for good. We experience them. And that's where I think most organizations are failing. They're not diving in. So this is about delivering pragmatic thoughts. How do we start that experience more easily? And here's the problem. There's too much techno-solutionism. Most projects begin and end in the same moment, in the same boardroom they started. It's generally begun with some hypothesis, saying, hey, we need to do this AI thing. We don't really know why, probably competitive advantage, but I bet AI will make us better at X, whether it's finance, logistics, et cetera, et cetera. But it remains just that, a dream. And we know dreams without goals are just dreams. So the first best way to frame an AI problem is to begin with a performance metric, not a hypothesis. Ultimately, AI is a simple thing. It labels things. You as a human tell what those things are and how they're related or not related. And we do that best as humans. So the way to begin was with this mindset. And what a good thought experiment for everyone on the line is, imagine AI isn't even real. It's just some island of people who can do all sorts of tasks for you. If you start thinking about it that way, then you'd imagine to yourself, okay, what kind of nonsense would I get out of my life? I'm a human, and I think we're all doing far too many non-human things right now. But there's a rule for this thought experiment. While you can offload all that nonsense work to the island, you cannot prescribe instructions to that island of people for what you do. Essentially, you can't tell them the how, but you can only give them the what or show examples of your work. Now, to further this thought experiment, imagine a part of your job or field where you could show many examples of what you do. Here's some off the top of my head. I'm a wildlife observer, and I watch cameras looking at tigers, hashtag Tiger King for every Netflix out there, moving across the grasslands or savanna. I'm a financial analyst, and when I see a change in a chart like X, I always do Y. I'm an environmental conservationist, and I see satellite imagery of a receding iceberg, and that means climate change. It's this type of thing. We have all of that in each of our own personal daily workflows and organizations. So the data you should then be choosing, or these examples, should probably be something with high volume, high velocity, like decisions made quickly, and most importantly, highly accurate. Because machines, when you pull this off, they can be coldly accurate in all the wrong ways. But the bottom line for us in broad engagement is to teach this way of thinking, to teach this method and baking a quote unquote I for AI. And I think that's how you start. You have to teach an enterprise to think in this new digital era, fall forward, fail forward. And I figure this way, at least you know what you're going to hit, because there will be major roadblocks. And with that, you'll start to build the environment where you empower these people within.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I want to go back to your car analogy, where maybe nobody individually knows all of the piece parts that make that car function, but certainly as a driver, we understand how we want it to work. We know that I think there's a tendency sometimes when we think about collaboration to just think about getting everyone right in a room, getting a lot of diverse skills in a room, in a project or in an office, and let's describe a problem and kind of go from there. But I think it takes more than that. So Peter, I'm interested, can you tell us what you're seeing in terms of the mechanics of what does it really mean to collaborate effectively in practice in this area?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously, the ways that we collaborated kind of before the global pandemic and the ways we collaborate after are likely going to change. But in my mind, at least, and in my personal opinion, humans don't change. The need to be able to share and shape ideas, whether we do that virtually through a variety of different methods, or if we're able to get back together shortly, super critical for AI projects in particular. So, and I think to allude back to some of the points the previous presenter said, it takes more than just a smart person who knows math and data and knows how to do the AI components. That's one fraction of the team. So collaboration is really between the business folks, the folks who really understand the mission or the business problem, and they understand every single dimension around that domain, as well as the leaders of particular parts of the business, and then the IT side, as well as the AI practitioners. So the collaboration really has to be multifaceted when taking a capability like AI and scaling that across an enterprise. To your point earlier, one of the things we are seeing directly related to collaboration is we're seeing some clients and large organizations elevating the role or the function of chief AI officer or chief data scientist or other nomenclature like that to the C-suite to help foster that collaboration between the AI practitioners they either have or that they contract out, or and the rest of the business. And that collaboration is kind of in two buckets. One is the projects that are ongoing that the company is doing that AI can somehow enable. And I think the captain referred to a lot of really interesting things previously. But there also be a second bucket, which is the big bets, right? What are the big thoughts? What are the ways that they can use the assets or the position in the industry or something unique to that business and combine it with AI in order to produce something new or bigger or new revenue stream for that company? And I see a lot of companies start the collaboration around the first. So they have a POC or POV. They really are interested in how do we bring these different parts of the business together across those functional lines, and then how do we, solve for the problem of X, whatever that is, and then we're going to use AI to help with that. I don't see as many companies thinking the second option, and I think now, personally, if you're going to collaborate around a topic for a company, what I work with a lot of them on is what is next? What is the next big bet, big thing that they can do? It's going to help lift them out of some of the situations that are created by the pandemic and business realities and so forth. So, collaboration across the teams and a multidisciplined, multifaceted team, but then also the types of questions that I think that collaboration needs to tackle is really, really key.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that we're starting to allude to as well is the need for cultivating broader literacy or understanding of what AI is and how these technologies can actually help. And again, what we see, because if we're, having a conversation, it helps if we're speaking somewhat the same language or have an understanding of what the capabilities and the constraints are. And in fact, as you can see here, for folks that are implementing AI widely, almost half, so almost a majority of, say they have a wide range of training, and the remainder are actually have some training and are building broader offerings. One of the things that's presumed, of course, is that you understand, how to train, and you have resources to train across a broad spectrum of skills. And I'm interested, Rob, in how is Seacoast addressing the issue of cultivating both talent and literacy within the organization?
Sure, and I'll start to say I agree that training is very important, and I think it's important to keep in mind that there are essentially sort of two layers to training and development. There's the training for the technical folks as well as training for the non-technical folks as well. In terms of the technical side, at least for a smaller company, I don't think it's too hard to address. If the company can allocate some budget and time, I think technical folks, along with their leader, hopefully they sort of know the training that they need, and you can plan for that. However, there's also the non-technical side, and this kind of relates back to what we're talking about earlier about collaboration through the organization, and this enhances that. And I'd ask everyone to keep in mind that where I work at Seacoast Bank, it's a primarily a service company that's over 90 years old, and you can't really expect or want everyone in the company to be an expert on artificial intelligence. But what you do want is your organization not only to be able to utilize analytical tools, but also to provide input and ideas. So what we've done in that regard is, and this might not work everywhere because we are a smaller organization, but I personally meet with if there's someone new to the finance team or someone new to the marketing team, for example, I personally meet with them to review what we've done, review kind of how and why we've done it, and then start brainstorming with them.
So kind of that active discussion, you can say, here's what we're doing, here's why, and through that they gain some knowledge and experience around that. That's really interesting. Now, Mike, I want to switch back to you for a minute. Now, one of the things that we do have a lot of discussions about is how to hire skills and to utilize partners. And both of these are pivotal components, I think, when you're developing the human talent pool and specifically looking at data science or AI-specific skills. I know in the USAF, though, you've also taken a bit of an alternate tack to identify resources within the organization that might grow into this role and into this area of play. Can you talk a little bit about how you guys have approached that?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm really excited about this topic as it just was recently passed as legislation for the Department of Defense, and moving from an idea to legislation in about less than a year is kind of a celebratory win for us. Here's how we took it on, and I think that it is applicable to our private organizations and broader public alike. The Department of Defense and federal government has a really long history of recognizing the critical significance and value of our personnel who have secondary non-English language proficiencies. Historically and continually, we actively seek to attract and retain those personnel who have two things. They have an aptitude to learn foreign languages, or they have existing foreign language fluencies they brought into our force. And we do this through an aptitude test and similarly through a proficiency test. And those people who score passing grades, they qualify for certain assignments where that specific language that's other than English is deemed valuable or mission critical to us. They also receive foreign language proficiency pay for this, commensurate with their secondary language and with their level of fluency as measured by testing. But as our organizations continue to integrate the technologies of the digital and information age, I think it's time we all recognize the reality that information of all categories and types is increasingly created, obtained, exchanged, and analyzed via computers and computer technologies. And consequently, the languages of computers themselves, computer languages, are as critically significant to our needs as any other non-native language. Languages like Python and Java and C++, each have their own unique vocabularies and sets of grammatical and construct rules, just like any other. Now, albeit these are constrained language and the comparison isn't necessarily one-to-one, but these are the unifying languages of our time. And when we look at organizations, and this might surprise people, the United States Air Force is 88% millennial. And I'll sit in a meeting and every once in a while someone will say millennial and I'm like, oh, you mean adults under 40? Got it. But I think what's important is that we recognize these untapped skill sets that our employees bring into our organizations. And we ask them the question because I promise there's someone at home who enjoys playing Minecraft or is a Bitcoin miner. And those skill sets, because they're so cross-cutting, they need to be asked about each of our roles, and they should be brought into each of our jobs themselves. So that's one way we're going about it, but also from the humanities perspective, again, baking an eye for AI, only 5% of this nation are going to be, hardcore coders or machine learning engineers one day, and hopefully, but at the same time, teaming those skill sets together, I think is the most important thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think it's really important for us all to realize that we don't all necessarily need to be AI deep experts, but we are all somewhat digital journeymen, even if that's just in our personal lives. And so bringing those experiences to bear, and especially I think on the usability side of things, and how people want to interact with these technologies can be really, really important. So I think that's just a great perspective for internal enlightenment and activation as well. So let's turn really quickly to the idea of technology transformation. And Astrid Unheim from Telenor really notes that IT agility is very, very key when it comes to AI, and that the difference between IT that works and that IT that doesn't work when it comes to things like machine learning is really quite large. And in fact, this is borne out again in the research that we have done, where we see that AI is actually just the tip of a very large technological iceberg, if you will. So those who have advanced AI practices also report having more mature data processes, having mature development processes and workflows. They've invested in a cloud infrastructure, and they have mature or maturing cybersecurity practices. So with you guys today, I'd like to touch on the data and development aspects, beginning with data, because data is both AI's lifeblood and its Achilles heel in a lot of ways. And success here is not about squirreling away lots of data and somewhat hoping for the best or pointing the machine at it. In fact, Rob, you have argued that if you say, let's just start gathering data, you might not go down the right path. So can you talk a little bit more about that and give us examples of the specific behavior or process change you've used to take advantage of your data for AI?
Yeah, sure. And this relates, I think, to our discussion earlier, that you shouldn't really be doing machine learning and analytics just for its own sake or just because everyone's talking about it. You really need to, lead with your strategy first. In our case, kind of from the beginning, we strongly felt that we could use data to deepen our relationships with our customers, and that idea really guided us. And for the first 2 years, we didn't really think much about AI or machine learning because we really needed to get our data in order. And what I mean by that is, as a bank, you potentially have access to a lot of data, but most of that data was spread out in either account or transaction level tables and not unified at the customer level. So we eventually built a holistic customer data set that has about 30,000 columns of data for each customer. And once we had that foundation in place, that's where things really began to take off for us. From there, we went into many directions, including building a customer lifetime value model, which estimates the future value of our customers. And that also proved to be very strategic for us and could branch in different directions. For example, we use our customer lifetime value models to apply, gets applied by machine learning to feed in various opportunities to within our marketing department, as an example. So that's kind of the path that we took, and it really was a multi-year path to get where we are. But now I feel we're in a very good spot.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. And again, it started with being very clear about the objective, and then looking at what are the types of data or information that might help us come up with a good algorithm or prediction, and then building that in. Now, Peter, you work with a broad swath of organizations. I'm actually interested in, organizations have mountains and mountains of data, and we assume that all of the information that we might need, and in fact, there's a lot of value in that data. People aren't getting the value out of their existing data assets. But how often, or is it, is it something that happens frequently where people realize that yes, we have mountains of data, but the information we now need to drive some of these new models or approaches doesn't yet exist, and we have to go out and either cultivate or create it?
Yeah, I think it runs the spectrum, right? So I have clients that are just starting to, try to understand the value of the data that they currently have, and then all the way to, clients that are, trying to synthesize or create data or get new data sets in order to support the types of the analysis or new products that they want to roll out. I think the key though is exactly what Rob was saying before, which is starting from the fundamental questions that you want to answer as part of your business. And I think one of the really interesting patterns that I've observed working with clients, and I'll give an example, is starting with a willingness to examine the assumptions that you've always had within your business, and then mapping the value of being able to revisit those back to AI and the data that you have. So, for example, one of the insurance companies that I work with had started down the path of, well, we need to collate all of our data, we need a data platform, we need to pull all this together, we're going to do AI, we're going to take the existing models that we have that run the business, and we're going to apply that on all that data. And what they quickly found out was, okay, all the assumptions that were in the models that they had built 10 years ago didn't match up with the data that was current on, where their expected losses and so forth were. So there was things that changed in the data over time that they hadn't factored in, and assumptions they were running their business on that they hadn't factored in. They'd fundamentally changed some of the dynamics, but they were still using that for price, promotion. They were using it for basically running the entire company. So that was a big kind of wake up moment to them, that they needed to go back and look at in depth what the data was telling them, where their assumptions were wrong in their current operating models that they had, and then go and approach it from a completely new and different, fresh view. And we worked together with them over time, and what we saw was just by refreshing and doing that process, they were actually able to tap in unrealized value, and they were vastly overcharging or vastly undercharging in certain sub-markets. And that was really valuable for them to be able to then go and capture the value that they needed to run their business. So I think the key for around the data is having an ROI mindset for all of it, and also be willing to revisit what things are kind of held sacred sometimes within companies as assumptions that are running the business, and be willing to look at that and see either what the data is telling you that could be different and revisit that, or where you can then show that you're up to date with your perspective on how the business should be run.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think data allows us to develop understanding, but to develop that understanding, we also have to understand the data. So that may be our AI data chicken and egg scenario. Now, I think in terms of challenging existing processes, one of the conversations that is gaining steam and has been around for a long time is the need for us to really rethink and reassess how we go about developing and deploying artificial intelligence or these advanced analytics solutions. And this looks very different in some ways than how we've approached transactional systems or even analytics or BI in particular in the past. AI algorithms, they're not determinate, they're probabilistic. The best trained systems are going to make mistakes, right? They're going to react in sometimes very unpredictable ways, or unfortunately predictable ways, as the environment changes. And that could be due to changing consumer behavior, unforeseen operating conditions, or the influence of interacting systems. So Peter, this is a pretty broad, discussion area, and there's a lot of work going on. But when it comes to operationalizing AI, what are really the key development or operations or DevOps practices, and why are they most important?
Yeah, thanks. I think there's a number of, first tools and techniques and processes that I would say are even just starting to emerge. So if you look at things like ML ops, you look at, how this fits in with, say, ITSM or some of these other processes that we have. I think we're just starting to see the beginning of how we do this in a way that is well managed, there's a good process and so forth. I think the key is a couple of things. So one is, again, multidisciplinary team. So even the creators of the models, they need context and domain expertise, and that has to start at the very, very beginning. The way that we draw the view for making AI operational from a technical perspective is actually an infinity symbol. And the reason for that is you have to start, if you will, on the left with the model concept, what you're trying to achieve, what the expected ROI is, and so forth. And so from that perspective, you have to have that multidisciplinary team. So it's super important because you're not necessarily going to be able to realize the value, as in the insurance example I gave you before, if you don't know how the industry expects to get a certain percentage of value out of each individual insured covered, and also what the different rules and regulations are by county, state, and from a national perspective. So that's kind of one, that talent. The other is just having a really clear view of how model is going to change over its life cycle and how the data is also going to change over its life cycle. So things like data drift are big challenges. So we always start on the far left with that kind of view of and the plan for how you're going to take this model, the ROI, as well as how it's going to progress over time. You plan all that out first. Then you go through your development and testing. And then you always have a gate, if you follow up to the right on an infinity symbol, you always have a gate around, operationalize or not, right? And you use that opportunity to then look at a couple different dimensions. So one, is it going to have a material impact on our business from a return on investment perspective? And then is it going to have a material impact on our customers, either from a positive or a negative perspective, right? And that's things like, is it ethical, is it right, and so forth. And then also, are we going to be able to, over time, be able to use and morph those models in order to continue to get continuous return on them? So once you get through that gate, then you go through your deployment, and then you go into the third area, which is really the technology side, which is, are we able to scale? Are we getting good, area under the curve, like measures of like model performance? Is the data drifting too much or too little? Do we need to revisit some of our assumptions? So it's really the monitoring and operationalizing of that. Once you have that in place, then you can go back and revisit some of your assumptions. And so if you think of that as kind of that infinity symbol, it's a continuous loop that you're constantly looking at in the models. And the time frames are obviously different depending on the complexity of the model, how much return you're getting on, and so forth. So, but it really comes down to those three areas. I always say there's kind of a three-prong approach that companies need to look at. There are kind of principles for making AI operational. The first is model performance is not the same as business performance. And that means you may have the best, area under the curve, it's 90% accurate in prediction and so forth, but if it's not going to return any actual business ROI, it doesn't matter how good your model is. And I find it's interesting because there's sometimes a tension between those two, between the business and the folks who are developing the model. This is something just as a key principle for AI at scale. Another is that, just because you have a platform or a tool, or you're using some sort of deep neural network, super cool technique, it doesn't necessarily mean, again, that it's going to provide value at the end to the mission or the business. Like, you really have to look at, what is the underlying infrastructure you need. For sure, that changes drastically with large scale AI deployments. But the platform is not going to solve problems around, people not wanting the insights that you're giving them and so forth. So I think that's another one. And then, of course, the idea around the culture, it has to be, if you're going to do that kind of AI at scale and make it operational, it has to become a reflex, right? It's really difficult if people are, one of the biggest challenges we have at AI scale is the lack of trust. You're used to a data warehouse running a certain model, and then that spits out a number, and that's what you base all of your planning and other things on. And so if it's kind of a black box, there's a trust issue. And so in order for AI at scale to really work and to make it be operational, you have to have a culture that, you know, reflexively understands kind of how the values are derived, as well as, you know, what the value is that they can, you know, then plug that into in other places of their business. So I think those are kind of the
Yeah.
three main areas that I would focus on for most clients.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that idea about having to, it's not just monitoring the system performance, but the actual business performance, the environment, the data, all of those profiles is very, very different for a lot of people. But you also talk about trust. And I think it would be remiss, we have a few minutes here before we're going to turn it over to you, the audience, for questions. But we know that there are you know, a whole emerging discussion in topical area and concerns around risk and ethics and trust in AI. And those concerns, you know, as our research shows, very, very broadly, from not delivering on ROI to propagating bias or inequality to these solutions just simply being too opaque or unpredictable. And Mike, I think you said this well. You said no one, you know, wakes up in the morning with an intention to do discriminatory or unfair AI. So can organizations do AI without considering ethics and risk? And how would you approach this in the USAF, which is clearly a high stakes environment?
Yeah, this is the thing that I think about most. I mean, you can design, think your way, and organize your companies and you know, departments around AI, and that's the easy stuff. But here's my overarching thought for our charge for the nation, private and public service alike, and accountability per se. And if you are anywhere in the AI development supply chain, you have a responsibility for this. You know, because there's an inherent duality to any AI that you develop. You know, a deep fake technology is the best thing in the world to detect breast cancer. It also creates fake news. So our focus and the thing that we've put forth in the United States Air Force, which is a public and available strategy on Google right now, is that we openly address the current realities of AI to ensure as well as we can that it's implemented only in ways consistent with fundamental human dignities and only for purposes consistent with democratic ideals, liberties, and laws. And that extends into the private sector. The applications we're talking about are designed and to analyze data and formulate predictions without overall guidance from us. It's back to that example. But that doesn't mean any of this is safe from the effects of human influences of our human biases. Just because an algorithm's analysis is based on only quote data doesn't mean its output will be neutral or objectively fair. It's quite common for human biases to be reflected in data, and when they are, it stands to reason that any analysis, strategies, or predictions based on that data is going to be biased as well. And worse, if decisions are made or actions are taken based on this biased analysis, then the underlying bias will, of course, perpetuate and possibly ingrain historical or cultural inequities even deeper into our organizations. So the steps necessary to ensure that doesn't happen are difficult, but they're not impossible. They require conscientious and concerted efforts at the development and training stages of machine learning algorithms, plus attentive analysis and oversight at the implementation and use stages. The first and most important step is to understand and acknowledge the underlying nature of the problem, and it's us. Bias in its essence is not necessarily a bad thing. It defines the tastes that we have, and in some ways it even keeps us from danger. But when our thoughts, preferences, and actions are memorialized in the data we create all around us, all the time, every TikTok video, every Instagram post, and it's made available to machine learning, the algorithm will discover those bias patterns. And in fact, and as we've discussed throughout all of this, discovering human pattern is the very purpose of a learning algorithm for the most part. The problem, though, is this: it's very difficult for AI to determine if those behaviors are based on fair or desirable attributes. But the one difference that separates us as Western society and our companies and our nation is the fact that when it does happen, think of Microsoft Tay or any unfair hiring practice, is that we are held to account and the conversation is out there. When we make choices on another nation's technology, those choices aren't presented any longer.
Yeah, and I think something that's really interesting in that is that organizations are taking a very deliberate approach to asking these questions and asking the hard questions and having this discussion. And what you can see here quickly is that advanced AI adopters do in fact have groups specifically tasked with AI policy and with risk management to address these issues. And things like ethics are an explicit area of concern. So while not many have necessarily hired ethicists, codes of ethics and principles are proliferating. Shouldn't use tongue twister words on these. So I think just sort of one last then perspective, and Rob, I'll look to you, is the idea around transparency and explainability, right? The ability to explain when and why AI is being used and how it makes its decisions. And again, we hear a lot here in relative to regulatory concerns, but our research also highlighted an emphasis on transparency with our internal employees and stakeholders and customers. So Rob, just as a final question before we go to Q&A, you deal with a lot of customer-facing employee workflows in your AI work. So why is it important to address the issues in this context, and how are you going about doing that?
Yeah, I'd like to start by speaking more generally that there really is no kind of one-size-fits-all answer to this question. And it's really the context of the models that I think really matters. There's considerations such as, who's using the model, how are they using it, who's impacted by the model, and even things like, is it a causality model that you're trying to explain something, which definitely needs to be explainable, versus a predictive model, which might tend to be more black box, right? And then this is all not to mention regulatory requirements. In our case, our models feed to the marketing team, which designs campaigns, which are then, sent out and in many cases do go to customer-facing associates to act on those models. And I'd say like for the marketing team in particular, we're very focused on being transparent and explainable in our models. Not only because the marketing team needs to have trust in the models, but there is a human intelligence aspect as well. Keeping in mind our marketing team, they have to deal with communications about coronavirus. Here in Florida, sometimes they have to stop everything and address hurricanes, right? So really our models are not to in any way kind of replace what they're doing, but to enhance their decision making. So that's why it's critical to be explainable for them. And then on the other hand, that downstream where the associates are acting on the model, the way I think of it is more like the Weather Channel, right? You get the information that it's 40% chance of rain, and that's what helps you do what you need to do. Then you don't really need that level of explainability at that level. So, in the end, just to summarize, it just really depends on which person or group that you're working with.
Yeah, I love that. Again, that idea about context is key. So how and people understanding that context and then knowing how to interact and make decisions based on that information appropriately. Now, I could go on for another few hours with you folks, but I think it would be a great time to turn it over to questions from the audience.
Thanks, Kimberly. We have plenty of good questions here, and we certainly welcome more from the audience. You just need to use the questions module on the GoToWebinar control panel. Here's our first question. At the starting point, it's hard for me to evaluate the potential of AI for my business. What are some early indicators that AI is right for me? And that's for anyone.
Yeah, this is Peter. I'll go ahead and start if that's okay with everyone else. I think it's a really great question. So, we get faced with this a lot. I think usually there's some sort of external pressure. So either the business is facing some sort of unprecedented event, like all businesses now, and then there's a sense that there needs to be, I think, starting with efficiencies is usually where most of our clients go. So if you look at all of the different front office, back office and other types of functions that you have within a company, and think through of like how it can be either automated, done better, those types of things. You don't necessarily have to know anything about AI to know that AI can generally help with a lot of the different areas from a cost efficiency perspective. I think that's one thing. I think another thing is if you're looking at data on a regular basis and you find yourself compiling data in spreadsheets and emailing it around or on a shared drive or something like that, that usually is a kind of an indicator to me that the company could do some better kind of views of their data with AI and even just some dashboarding that would allow them then to kind of take that first initial step into using AI across their company. And I guess I think the third thing then that we typically look at is, is there kind of a new area that the company wants to get into? Is there like a new acquisition or a new functional area or other things like that? Definitely, it's a really good place to leverage AI and look at that as an indicator that you guys could use that.
Yeah, and I'd just like to amplify one piece is a lot of people want to start with the biggest problem that they have and take on a domain that's too large. Toy problems work, especially to help us understand broader concepts, and building something small on a subset of your data. And that is a good point. If you have a lot of Excel files, start there. And the trick is to get something working, then iterate fast. And if it is working, you'll find that within a couple months or a few weeks of deployment, your humans, the people, should be asking a different question, which then you're measuring different data, and you enter into that flywheel effect we were speaking about earlier, the infinity symbol. So don't be afraid to start with a toy problem.
Exactly.
Okay, great. We have several questions about AI literacy. People ask, how can we cultivate it? Can you provide examples of how you helped employees understand how the values were derived, especially if they're not AI savvy? Do you have classes on AI fundamentals and more along that line? So if you could talk a little bit about AI literacy and how to cultivate it and maybe some specific tools for doing so.
Well, let's talk about the STEM discipline. First, asking the question, who knows how to code? Largely the problems that you'll face in machine learning, you don't have to build a model yourself. It's been given to the world as what private companies and enterprises have looked at as a due right and obligation to the public sector. So starting with that question. The second piece on the STEM side is the barriers to education to learn how to program and code have never been lower. And there's 6 companies off the top of my mind, especially in this time of quarantine when people have a desire to learn, that we reward that desire and cover those costs with something provided commercially, or they come back with the certificate and we immediately say we will make up or we'll pay you back for the costs that you incurred to bring that skill set to our enterprise. And then lastly, I had briefly mentioned the social sciences. We look at how we educate our workforce in horizons. We have strategists, and generally speaking, they're the proverbial boardroom, and they have no familiarity with the topic. So we offer flagship program lines, 2-day courses to teach them the fundamentals of AI and just how to think about it. Then we have managers who manage the projects. Essentially, it's the design thinking part we talked about, organizing cross-functional teams and creating the right environment and procuring the right software that you need. And then the practitioners. And those people are the ones that we send to courses and everything else. But if you break it down into those 3 silos, you can start building those cross-functional teams.
Yeah, this is Peter. I will just add on to that. So I think that's absolutely right. I think the other thing that I spend a lot of time on is, literacy at the executive level. I think is important for them to understand why investments are going to return some sort of value. And then you have to, I think, teach board members, C-suite, next clicks down, some basic concepts of how things work, allow them to experience what a project looks like, I think that has gone a long way in order to helping the overall literacy of an organization if you're able to target at that. And we've done lots of those seminars. Usually they take the form of some sort of one-day or half-day workshop. Those types of engaged sessions where they get to learn and live it at the executive level, I think also helps with the literacy, and it also helps pave the way for training more people internally, more projects that are more automated, more value realization, and so forth.
Great, thank you. We're going to run a little over so that we can get a couple more questions in here. This is a question from Mike. It says, when did the U.S. Air Force Collaboration Challenge start, and how long did it take you to start seeing relevant operating impacts?
I think you have to measure a little bit, manage expectations. Managing expectations, probably the best advice to every aspect of life. It is a chicken or the egg problem. So largely, when you're moving forward with this and want to do it at an enterprise scale, you have to manage the expectations of the C-suite, because what you need to get in place are representative forms of data. Again, anecdotally, in every AI project I've run, the data curation aspect to get it ready for machine learning generally costs, somewhere around 40 to 50% of the entire budget that I originally projected. So that's number one. Number two, then you have to make sure that you're on the appropriate tech stack and have an environment where you can even build a model. And that takes a little bit of time. And then thirdly, the experience of throwing it into the wild, I like to say, and seeing how it resonates with the workforce. And then furthermore, are they operating differently or are they not? Because if they're not, it probably wasn't a good AI problem. It takes, not an insignificant amount of time to get the what I would consider the more important thing is the infrastructure and environment in place, because once that exists, you enter into the virtuous cycle. So it took, not an insignificant amount of time on the, order of a couple of years.
Great, thank you. For all of you, what are your thoughts on the integration of AI with various HR functions such as training, professional development, any others if you want to address them? How do you expect AI to affect those functions? Anybody?
Well,
Yeah.
okay, I'll jump. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
You first.
Well, I'll jump in. When it comes, there is like, it is back to the chicken and the egg. I think when it comes to educating, it's much like we're learning now in tailored education and making sure that when it comes to better delivering courseware and things that resonate to people learning, AI is incredibly beneficial. You can even apply to AI to learning about AI. And, I guess in the course of this pandemic right now, we should recognize that putting people into the digital sphere to learn is an important thing to do, because then again, you're memorializing what happened, and then you can start extrapolating and abstracting patterns and behaviors based on what they're doing in the course of learning.
And this is Rob. I was a little bit quiet joining in there because we really haven't gone down the path of applying analytics to HR, and I think it's just more because of prioritization, having a small team. But I do agree that there is a very high potential there. And I know anecdotally, one of the things that I read that was interesting was that they looked at there was a study on employee attrition and age. And although they found that the age was not related to attrition directly, but they did find that if you were a young person working with a team of older people, or an old person working with a team of younger people, that then there was attrition, I guess, because you didn't feel like you fit into the team. So, that would be an example of something, as an opportunity we could certainly look into.
Yeah, and this is Peter. Sorry, I was clearing my throat there for a second. would say that for us, this is one of the fastest growing areas of our practice. When you can take and understand kind of the entire employee digital journey and life cycle within a company, what that looks like from recruiting, retaining, performance, overall satisfaction level. There's a lot of different places where you can use AI to help with that, with the right safeguards and the right oversight, I will caveat with. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is in a surge of requests from our clients around how do you use analytics to help make some of these very difficult decisions they have to face as a result of a lot of the shutdowns around the pandemics is kind of one angle. The other, though, is a lot of our clients are currently hiring, and so they're asking us to use AI to go out and find candidates with kind of the right skill sets as a matches, and then be able to actually go and advertise for jobs that they have that they've created even during this time. And so it is one of the most fastest growing areas that we've seen, and we have just a huge practice around that is expanding. I think mostly because they want to be able to be a lot more efficient in the HR space, but also to be able to better take care of the employees that they have.
If I may, very, very quickly, I would be very hesitant about employing or deploying AI into hiring practices or HR, back to the bias conversation. If we are not well practiced in safe spaces, there are too many bad news stories, and I think that's the right word is dangerous place to start, frankly.
Yeah, isn't the right place to start, but there's certainly lots of controls that you couldn't put in place. And really, it's about matching folks around, and it's less around the AI side and more of like the search and match side.
Okay, great. Let's do one more quick question and maybe make it a lightning round. Someone asks, what's your expectation or forecast about the industries that would be the top implementers, top AI implementers in the near future? So again, maybe just lightning round, 3 or so.
It's Rob. I'd still say financial institutions because we're sitting on just an enormous amount of data, and I think a lot of it's still untapped in many organizations.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say I would maybe turn a little bit different. The ones that I see where it's going to grow the most is likely in resources, which includes energy, oil and gas, utilities, things like that. I think there's a huge space there that we are seeing continuously increase. I would agree, definitely financial services has a lot of data and how they use it. We haven't seen that. And I actually think there's a lot of really great areas to still explore within the federal space as well. They've been famous for using data and doing analytics for a while in order to create policy and so forth. But I think there's a lot of spaces still I expect that to see greatly in the federal space.
Outside of the federal piece, I would say that we'll see a reinvigorated conversation on supply chain, particularly after what's happened over the past couple months. In addition to that, while there is a lot of AI research and development going into the application layer on devices and similarly in healthcare, our hospital IT and core IT to deliver AI is clearly broken. So that's going to have a very focused effort. And in law, you'll see a significant uptick in sorting case precedent and more dangerously, prescribing, their cases, right?
Okay. Thank you so much.
And
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think that, in fact, to Peter's point, there's a lot of growth, and we'll see a lot of growth in government and in the public sector. That's also driving a lot of the conversation about appropriate use, ethics, and risk. I think where we're going to actually see the most, not necessarily overall growth, but some of the most advanced use cases in play is probably in the manufacturing space. They're going digital big, whether it's on the plant floor or in supply chain, and they may be on some of the front end of some of the more predictive AI and prescriptive AI applications moving forward.
Super. Thank you. That is all we have time for today. Thank you to our audience for joining us. I'd also like to thank our speakers and our sponsor, SAS. Over the next few days, please look out for a feedback survey that we'll send the audience via email. We greatly appreciate your feedback and your thoughts. Again, audio recording of this program will be available within 3 to 4 business days, and we'll let you know how to access that. Again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.